Hi there guys! In this video we're going to cover a key component of the AP US History exam, and that is SAQs. The way, and I'm going to talk about the format and how you do that using the RACE model. Imagine that you are writing your SAQ response and you want to race to the finish for each question. So we're going to cover in this video types of questions, the rules for the SAQ, and of course the RACE strategy.
Like a race? A race? He's a race. I hope I win.
And of course, the way you win on the SAQ is earning those points, right? So first I want to talk about types of questions. There are always 3 tasks to do. Usually College Board formats them by labeling them A, B, C. If you see A, B, C, there's 3 tasks, 1 task each. You may, and I'll show you an example in a moment, you may see an SAQ that's just labeled A and B. Either A or B would have 2 tasks within that A or B prompt to do. But you're always thinking of 3 things you need to do, and so you need to race through the model 3 times. Also, these types of questions will have stimulus and non-stimulus examples, so they can use a quote, interpretation, image, graphs, charts, political cartoons. And on the AP exam, you're going to have 4 questions. You write 3. And sorry, there's a typo there. Questions 1 and 2 are mandatory, and then 3 or 4 will be non-stimulus, and I'll show you some examples. So a primary source example. Here you have a quote from Congressman Thaddeus Stevens from R.A.C.E, taken in 1865. You can see that there are 3 clear things. So 1, explain the perspective in regards to Reconstruction. B, a policy that was adopted that supports his point of view, so you need to think of a specific historical example. And then C is asking an opposite of that. So there's an example of a primary source for you. A visual example might look something like this, and here we have a chart or a graph, right? Again, there are 3 tasks for you to do, especially if you're looking at images. It's really important that you look at the time frame, right, of that prompt. Here we have an interpretation of secondary sources, and this one we have 2 historians, Matthew Josephson and H.W. Brands, both talking about a similar topic, right? And in this case, if you read the first prompt, A, it's asking about their interpretations of business leaders who rose to prominence in era 6, which is the Gilded Age. So we know that they're talking about robber barons and captains of industry. Usually when you see an interpretation source, A is going to ask about a similarity or a difference, and then B and C would usually ask about providing historical evidence to support Historian 1 and Historian 2, as you can see here. You also may see political cartoons. So here's an example from the Progressive era. You have the cartoon here, and then 3 tasks. What's the perspective of the political cartoonist? An event that supports it, that led to the historical situation. So you need a cause of this problem. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair would be an excellent answer. And then 1 outcome, the Meat Inspection Act, is an excellent example for that prompt. Finally, you may see one where there is no stimulus. Here, it's just labeled A, B, and C. So identify 1 factor that increased tensions between Great Britain and the 13 colonies, right? And how did it lead to the American Revolution? B says give a 2nd factor, and C says give a 3rd factor. How did it help lead to the American Revolution? So Stamp Act, Sugar Act, and the Boston Massacre could be A, B, and C, right? The most important part is you explain how did it help lead to the American Revolution. The final example for the type of question I want to show you is choice. So In this example, you can see A, briefly explain why one of the choices below best represents the beginnings of American identity. So you're going to choose one, and that's the first task in A. Then the second task embedded within A is to provide an example that supports your response. So why did you choose the signing of the Declaration of Independence? And you need an answer to support that. You need a reason using historical evidence to support it. It's the first one that officially declared the United States to be overthrowing King George III, right? B, you need to explain why one of the other choices was not as useful. So the ratification of the Constitution is not as useful because blah, blah, blah. So you need to explain why. Here you can see an example of choice and then also just two responses. But notice there are two parts in A. All right, so we've talked about types of questions. Now let's talk about the most important thing, the rules. So the rules. You must answer 3 questions from 4. So questions 1 and 2 are required. Question 1 on the AP US History exam will be interpretation. You're going to be given some type of primary or secondary source, most likely secondary. Question 2 will always be some type of stimulus, and that can be the political cartoon, it could be an image, it could be a graph, it could be any type of stimulus. Visual, like an image, or it could be a text as well. Then you get to choose question 3 or question 4. That becomes from the first half of the American history or the second half, eras 6 through 9. And there's also no stimulus. These are just direct A, B, C. You also get 40 minutes, start and stop. There are no time warnings. There are no suggestions to move to the other prompts. You need to manage your time effectively, and that gives you about 12 minutes to answer 3 questions. Finally, most important rules. Please read all parts of the question and brainstorm your answers for A, for B, and for C, because as you saw in the examples, they are linked. And finally, stay in the box. So when you handwrite them, you most likely have a very similar sheet like this. You must contain your answers within that. For the 2020 exam, since it will be online, if you do see an SAQ, they will probably have maybe a word count or a maximum number of lines you're allowed to fill in your response. I'm not quite sure what they're going to have yet. They haven't released those guidelines. So, how do you go about answering a good SAQ? And that is to follow RACE. So, in this final part of this video, we'll go over the strategies on how to do that. So, how do you begin your response? Well, R, restate the prompt. You begin your response by restating the question. Why? This clues the reader and you that you're actually answering it. So here's an example. This is a real one from College Board. Briefly explain how one specific historical development represents an accomplishment under the Articles of Confederation. So the quick way to start your response is one success under the Articles was. Right? Just very, very simplistic. You guys have been restating the prompt since you've been in 3rd grade. Why is it important? Well, it helps clue you in and remind you and make sure that you understand what is being asked of you. Then we need to A, and that is to give your answer. You want to be specific using accurate historical information. Your answer should be very concise. Example, the cult of domesticity. So, for my answer here, was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. That was a success. It's that simple. State your answer. C in our RACE model stands for clarify your answer. That means you need to define or describe what your answer was. So you need to explain what that law did, and here I did that. Was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which successfully divided newly acquired and unsettled land of the Ohio River Valley and outlined the process for statehood. Great, right? By reading this response, you know this student understands the significance of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. They understand what it did. And finally, E. E is the most important one and the most likely where you are to mess up on your response, and that is explain. You need to explain how your evidence, how your answer that you chose connects back to the prompt. Usually the word because should be in there. You're explaining why this matters, or why in this case is it an accomplishment of the national government. And I have that in bold here. It's an additional sentence. This method for statehood represents an accomplishment. Notice I'm linking it back to the question because I'm explaining why it continued to be used for later Western expansion through the 20th century. So clearly explaining why it matters so much. So that's the RACE model. If you follow this, you're going to get to the finish line and you're going to be writing your SAQ and beating out all the others. Thanks, guys, and have a good day.